Imagine a place where wealth and lust reign absolute, but at the same time corruption and violence corrode every corner of society. In Sodom and Gomorrah, endless parties and uncontrolled pleasures hid a cruel system of exploitation and inequality. Traders accumulated gold and silver while the poor starved. Judges manipulated laws in favor of the powerful, and paganism dictated the rules, leading even to human sacrifices in the name of strange gods. But everything has a limit. When justice is sold and hedonism replaces morality, divine judgment becomes inevitable. The Bible reports that Sodom and Gomorrah were swept from the map by a rain of fire and sulfur, destroying not only their imposing buildings, but an entire civilization that challenged divine laws. Even Lot's wife paid dearly for her hesitation, turning into a statue of salt when looking back. But what really happened in these cities before destruction? Why does Ezekiel 16:49 mentions pride, abundance of bread, and indifference to the poor as the true sods of Sodom? Let's dive into the reality of these condemned metropolises and understand how their mistakes echo to this day. Sodom and Gomorrah were not any cities. They were true centers of wealth and lust, where land pleasures surpassed any notion of morality. For those looking out, they were vibrant metropolises, full of life, busy markets, and grandiose buildings. But behind this gleaming facade was hidden a place where corruption and violence reigned without restrictions. Anyone who had gold and influence could do whatever they wanted, while the underprivileged were ignored, abused, or explored. The concept of right and wrong seemed not to exist in these cities. Endless parties, pagan rituals, and unbridled hedonism defined the elite's lifestyle. Nothing was considered taboo. Personal pleasure was the only law that mattered, and those who dare challenge this culture were quickly silenced. Foreigners and weaker were treated with contempt, while corrupt justice protected only those who had power. Any trace of compassion had been swept from the heart of the people. But what happens when an entire society gives itself to selfishness, injustice, and contempt for others? The history of Sodom and Gomorrah shows us that moral decay always has consequences. When people live only to themselves, ignoring the suffering of others, sooner or later collapse becomes inevitable. And for these cities, the end was closer than they imagined. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities of great prosperity. Their markets boiled with traders who negotiated gold, silver, rare spices, and fine tissues from distant lands. Merchants and rulers accumulated unimaginable fortunes, transforming these cities into centers of opulence. Money flowed like a river, and wealth was seen as a symbol of status and power. But this abundance did not mean justice or generosity. On the contrary, greed dominated relationships, and inequality was brutal. While the rich delighted in extravagant banquets, the poor struggled to get a loaf of bread. The powerful manipulated trade for their own benefit, and anyone who dared to challenge this system was crushed. Justice served only those who had money to buy it, leaving the less favored at the mercy of exploitation. Even so, Sodom and Gomorrah were seen as models of success and progress, as their apparent wealth overshadowed the deep problems of their society. However, the true value of a civilization is not only measured by the gold that it accumulates, but the way the weaker treats. Ezekiel 16:49 makes it clear the sin of Sodom was not only immorality, but also the pride, selfish abundance, and lack of compassion for the needy. But for those who controlled trade, this reality didn't matter. They were too busy telling their coins, without realizing that divine judgment was already on the way. In Sodom and Gomorrah, social inequality was not just an economic issue, but a trademark of society. While the nobles and traders enjoyed luxurious mansions, endless banquets, and fine clothes, the poor were left to die on the fringes of the city without any help or compassion. Wealth was accumulated by a few, while most lived in misery. The abundance existed, but it was reserved only for those who had influence. The rest was invisible, treated as disposable. The contrast was shocking. On the one hand, lush parties, gold-adorned temples, and markets full of exotic spices. On the other, hungry children roaming the streets, abandoned sick and enslaved workers. Anyone who was born poorly would hardly escape this condition, for opportunities were reserved only for those who already belonged to the elite. The rich ones closed their eyes to the suffering of others, believing that their prosperity was a divine right and that the miserable deserved their luck. But ignoring the needy has a price. The Bible warns us in Ezekiel 16:49 that one of the greatest sins of Sodom was precisely its arrogance before the poor and needy. The city had everything to be an example of prosperity and generosity, but chose the path of indifference and selfishness. In the end, what they did not realize was that no earthly wealth could protect them from the divine judgment that was already approaching. At first glance, Sodom and Gomorrah seemed true monuments of greatness. Its streets were wide and busy, its markets overflowed from rare goods, and their palaces and temples were symbols of a rich and powerful society. Imposing buildings rose as proof of their prosperity, full of sculptures, adorned columns, and gold details. The luxury was everywhere, and any unsuspecting visitor could believe he was facing a blessed civilization. But behind this glorious facade, a dark reality was hidden. While the palaces sported gold and marble, the farthest neighborhoods were true ruins, where poverty and violence dominated. The beautiful buildings only served to feed the vanity of the powerful, while the people lived overwhelmed in precarious huts. Great temples, instead of being places of piety and justice, were used for pagan practices, idolatry, and even rituals of human sacrifices. The beauty of cities was just an illusion. The false prosperity of Sodom and Gomorrah masked a society in moral ruins. His mistake was to believe that their constructions and riches could protect them from the inevitable. But the greatness of a city is not measured by the height of its buildings, but by the righteousness of its people. When divine judgment came, even the gold palaces could prevent the rain of fire and sulfur that reduced everything to ashes. The golden brightness of the dirtiest cities in history went out forever. In Sodom and Gomorrah, the search for pleasure was the only rule. The parties lasted days, waged to excess food, wine, and all forms of lust. Morality? An outdated idea. What mattered was to satisfy every desire, without limits or consequences. Pagan temples promoted rituals in which everything was allowed, and the city's elite via hedonism as a sign of progress. Personal pleasure was above any principle, and anyone who dared questioning this lifestyle was ridiculed or worse, silenced. The concept of family and commitment had dissolved in the culture of indulgence. Relationships were disposable, alliances were exchanged for nights of momentary pleasure, and even religious rituals involved orgies and sacrifices. Carnal pleasure was elevated to the category of divinity, and any resistance was seen as ignorance or weakness. Parties with exotic dances, endless drunkenness, and power games between the nobility happened daily, reinforcing the idea that everything was allowed for those who had wealth and status. But when a society puts pleasure above all, it inevitably destroys inside. Sodom and Gomorrah hedonism not only corrupted the city, but made it blind to its own decay. While residents surrendered to a life of excess, divine judgment was already on its way. And when the party finally ended, the destruction came without warning. In Sodom and Gomorrah, justice was just an empty concept. The courts did not serve to protect the innocent, but to keep the powerful in control. Corrupt judges were easily bought, and any crime could be covered if there were enough gold involved. The system favored the rich and merciless, while the poor, foreign, and unfortunate were left to their own luck. The laws existed, but they were applied selectively, ensuring that those at the top were never punished for their transgressions. Violence was a daily part of life in the city. Gangs took over the streets, travelers were attacked without anyone interfering, and the weak were brutalized simply because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The most influential residents saw this as perverse entertainment, a power game where only the most relentless survived. Any sense of empathy or true justice had been eroded by a cycle of impunity and unbridled selfishness. Chaos and corruption made Sodom and Gomorrah a place where right and wrong meant nothing. There was no mercy. There was no mercy, the law of the strongest. But when evil becomes the only law, destruction is only a matter of time. Divine judgment would not come only because of individual sins, but for the total rot of a society that had rejected any notion of justice and compassion. And so, the fate of cities was already sealed. In Sodom and Gomorrah, women and children were seen as mere goods. In a system where power and lust dominated, a person's value was measured by its usefulness to the interests of the strongest. Women were treated as objects of pleasure and currency of exchange in political and social negotiations. The concept of family and respect had been destroyed, and those who should be protected became the most vulnerable. The laws did not support them, and their voice was ignored in a society driven by selfishness. Children also did not escape this exploration cycle. Many were abandoned or sold as servants, forced to grow in an environment where compassion was a non-existent luxury. Some were offered in pagan rituals, sacrificed in ceremonies that allegedly guaranteed prosperity to the city. Amid the brilliance of the parties and golden temples, innocent lives were lost, victims of a culture that saw human beings only as a means to get pleasure or power. But the blood of the innocent always calls for justice. Sodom and Gomorrah had become symbols of human degradation, where even the fragile were sacrificed to maintain a corrupted system. When a society reaches this point, its end is just a matter of time. Divine judgment would not be, and the city that once proud of its wealth and pleasures would soon become just a jumble of ashes. The warning came, but few believed. Sodom and Gomorrah were so plunged into corruption and hedonism that they ignored the signs of divine judgment. Lot, one of the few righteous in the city, was visited by angels who warned him about imminent destruction. But the population mocked the idea, believing that their wealth and power made them untouchable. However, no amount of gold could protect them from what was coming. The time of impunity had come to an end. So it happened. At dawn, a rain of fire and sulfur fell from the sky, consuming everything in its way. The palaces, the pagan temples, the prosperous markets, and even the alleys where the poor struggled to survive dawn escaped. The destruction was complete and irreversible. Those who tried to escape were swallowed by the flames, and the once glorious empire of lust became only ashes. It was an unprecedented divine punishment, a response to the pride and the wickedness of those cities. Not everyone managed to obey the order of not looking back. Lot's wife, unable to detach himself from the past, became a statue of salt by disobeying divine orientation. His destiny has become a symbol of the danger of clinging to what he has already condemned. Sodom and Gomorrah, once synonymous with prosperity, were now just memories erased by divine wrath. An eternal reminder that no civilization can resist when completely moving away from justice and compassion. Sodom and Gomorrah were not only cities of luxury and corruption, but also centers of worship of pagan gods. In each corner, imposing temples housed statues of foreign deities, and idolatry was part of the local culture. Instead of seeking justice and compassion, the people dedicated themselves to extravagant rituals that often involved disturbing practices. True faith had been replaced by ceremonies of exaltation to the ego, pleasure, and power. These services were not limited to simple offerings. Many involved dark rituals, including human sacrifices, where children were burned alive to please the gods. The population saw these practices as common, a tradition that would guarantee prosperity and abundance. But ironically, the more they surrendered to these customs, the more they sank into moral degradation and violence. Paganism did not bring blessings, but a people who lost their identity and any sense of humanity. Ezekiel 16:49 points out that Sodom fell not only for his lust, but also for his arrogance and lack of mercy. Idolatry blinded the city, making its inhabitants insensitive to the suffering of others and completely distant from the true purpose of life. They bowed before statues, but ignored the needy. When the rain of fire fell, the gods who worshipped could not save them. In the end, it was only the ruin of a civilization that changed the truth for the mistake. Sodom and Gomorrah were cities that seemed untouchable. His wealth, imposing palaces, and luxurious lifestyle gave the illusion that nothing could knock them down. But every civilization that ignores justice and gives itself to corruption and hedonism is doomed to destruction. When divine judgment came, there was no additional notice, no time for repentance. In a single moment, everything that seemed eternal achievements was reduced to ashes. The impact of destruction was so great that, to this day, archaeologists and scholars try to understand what happened to these cities. Some theories suggest that a natural disaster, such as the explosion of a meteor or volcanic activity, would have caused catastrophe. But whatever the scientific explanation, the symbolism of history is clear. No society can prosper indefinitely when moving away from morality and compassion. The end of Sodom and Gomorrah was not only physical, but also spiritual. The history of these cities serves as a timeless warning. No matter how wealth a civilization accumulates, if it forgets the values that support a just society, its ruin is inevitable. Just as Lot's wife looked back and found her fate in the form of a salt statue, those who insist on clinging to what she is condemned are in danger of being destroyed with him. The question that remains is, what can Sodom and Gomorrah teach us about today? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is not just an ancient account of divine destruction and punishment. It is a mirror for any society that is consumed by greed, injustice, and unbridled pursuit of pleasure. After all, how many times have we seen grandiose civilizations collapse not for lack of riches, but for moral corruption and inequality? What begins with small concessions turns into a decay cycle that, sooner or later, leads to collapse. And here is the great reflection: does Sodom and Gomorrah errors still be repeated these days? Indifference to the needy, the exploitation of the weak, the normalization of corruption and violence, all this is part of our reality. The difference is that now we don't have to wait for a shower of fire to see the signs. We can learn from the past and choose a different path, one that leads to the construction of something solid, fair, and lasting. If this content has made you reflect, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications for more videos like this. Here we explore stories that are not just curiosities, but valuable lessons to understand the world and our own journey. And now I ask you, what do you think would have happened if Sodom and Gomorrah had chosen another way? Leave your opinion in the comments.